Episode 1. The mirror wasn't supposed to be there. The boy didn't scream when the mirror showed his death, because it also showed what was waiting behind it. They said the rectory had been abandoned since 1902. They lied. Father Malric entered the crumbling stone structure, the air thick with mildew and something far worse, a memory. The village had warned him, no priest days. They either leave or change. But he didn't believe in superstitions, not until he found the mirror. It wasn't mentioned in any inventory, no record, no photos. A 6-foot-tall cathedral-shaped slab of blackened glass bolted to the chapel's eastern wall, hidden behind rotten curtains, dustless, untouched by time. Watching, on the first night, he prayed before it, and the candle beside him extinguished itself without wind. On the second, he looked into it, and the reflection didn't match his movement. His own eyes stared back with a hate he didn't recognize. On the third, he heard a boy whisper in Latin on the Fashion Day, "He shall not see the face of God." But there was no boy, only silence, only the mirror. The villagers had a name for it, El Espejo de la Negación, mirror of denial. It was said to show not what you were, but what heaven refused to acknowledge. And Father Malric had begun to see things, lashes behind the glass, fingers clawing, a crucifix turning to ash, his own collar burning on his neck. And the boy, always that boy. No one in the village remembered him being assigned here. No bishop answered when he called. His phone showed dates that didn't exist, and on the 7th night, he heard a voice from the mirror. It sounded like his own, but it called him by a name he had buried 20 years ago. That was when he realized the mirror wasn't showing the future. It wasn't showing the past. It was reflecting the soul God had already cast out, his. And as his reflection began to smile back, he whispered, shaking, bleeding from the eyes, "If God doesn't recognize me anymore, then what's about to crawl through the glass must know me better." Episode 2. The boy behind the glass. They say mirrors only reflect what is there, but the one in the chapel reflected someone waiting to be remembered. Father Malric awoke on the chapel floor, his collar soaked in sweat, and something, thicker dark, iron-scented, and warm. The mirror stood silent before him. No voice, no movement, but something had changed. His own reflection was gone. In its place stood the boy, thin, pale, around 9 years old, lips stitched shut with wire, hands pressed flat against the other side of the glass. Eyes not bleeding but watching, Malric staggered back, knocking over a candle. The flame caught the hem of his robe, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the boy, not just because he was a natural, but because he recognized him. Lucas, a name he hadn't spoken since seminary, a boy found dead in the dormitories. No wounds, no signs of struggle, only his corpse, kneeling before a shattered mirror, and a bloody page in his hand that read, "He showed me his face." Then he turned away. Malric had buried the memory, buried what he did, buried what he didn't do, and now Lucas was waiting, in the same pose, behind a mirror that should not exist. The priest dropped to his knees and began to pray, but the words dried in his throat. He reached for his crucifix, but it burned cold. The chapel around him seemed to groan, wood creaking like lungs exhaling their last breath. Then the mirror rippled. A single crack appeared small but deep, running like a scar from the boy's brow down to his throat. And for the first time, the boy moved. He raised one trembling hand and began to trace letters into the glass with a blackened finger. "YOU." The lights in the chapel flickered, the altar behind him split, and the voice from the mirror, raspy, layered, broken like when dragging a cross, bone whispered, "God doesn't forget." "But you did." Malric turned and ran, but the chapel door no longer led outside. It led to more mirrors, a hallway of reflections, each one twisted, each one screaming silently through their own private hells. And in every single one, Malric was the only one still human, for now. Episode 3. The corridor of the condemned. He thought he had stepped into a hallway, but what he entered was a procession of sins, each one still breathing. Father Malric didn't remember how long he had been walking, or if he was even walking at all. The corridor had no end, no beginning, just mirror after mirror, each one framing a different version of himself. Some weeping, some laughing, one gnawing its own arm in silence. He reached out to touch the cold glass of the nearest reflection. hoping to feel something real, but the reflection didn't move. It just stared at him, with hollow sockets where I should be. And then it smiled. "We died for what you buried." The glass rippled like water and snapped back. Malric stumbled away, his breath growing ragged. He turned in, and now the hallway was full of whispers, children's voices, women, old men praying, all repeating the same phrase in a language older than Latin. Reflected, forgotten, rejected, he dropped to his knees, clutching his rosary, his last anchor. Beads splintered in his grip. They weren't wooden anymore. They were teeth. Suddenly, the corridor bent, not like a normal hallway but like a neck-breaking underweight. And there, at the bend, a single door, carved with ash and sealed with blood. Above it, scratched in with fingernails and sorrow, a message. "Behind this door is your confession, the one you never made, and the soul that paid for it." Malric hesitated. He remembered a chapel. He remembered seminary. He remembered a boy named Lucas. But now something deeper stirred, something he had never told a silent even God. His hand touched the door. It was warm, and it pulsed like it had a heartbeat of its own. Then it opened, and inside, there was no room, only another mirror. This one dripping, not with water, but with oil and wine and blood. And within it, the boy spoke, not through lips, but through the wound in his chest. "You called yourself a man of God, but you left me screaming behind the veil." And as Malric tried to turn away, the mirror gripped him from within. Hands small, cold, relentless clawed through the glass, dragging him in. He didn't scream, because in that moment, he remembered exactly what he had done. Episode 4, Confession without a priest. He thought the worst part was being pulled into the mirror, but the mirror wasn't a prison. It was a pulpit built for a sermon God refused to hear. There was no sensation of falling, no impact, no gravity, just silence. A silence too perfect to be holy. Father Malric opened his eyes, but what he saw couldn't be real. He stood inside a cathedral that seemed carved from smoke pillars rising into nothing, walls breathing like lungs filled with ash. The stained glass windows didn't show saints. They showed sinners, each one burning in reverse. At the altar stood Lucas, alive, whole, but different. His body glowed faintly, as if lit from within by something unclean. And in his chest, still, that gaping hole, still bleeding, still whispering. Malric staggered forward. "Lucas, what is this place?" The boy turned slowly. This is where the forgotten come to scream. But here, screams turned to sermons. Behind him, the mirror stood again, framing them both. Except now, Malric couldn't see his own reflection. Only a rotted priest's robe, empty and swaying, as if worn by a wind that remembered how he used to pray. He dropped to his knees. "I didn't kill you," Malric muttered. "I wasn't the one." Lucas blinked. "You didn't stop it. You didn't speak. You walked past a soul bleeding behind the confessional and chose silence over salvation." Malric shook, rage and regret tearing his throat raw. He remembered the night. Lucas, trembling, asking for a moment to speak in private. The locked chapel door, the screams that followed, and Malric turning up the hymn volume to cover it. He wept, but Lucas only stepped closer. "You never confessed that moment, and God does not forgive what is hidden behind pride." Suddenly, Malric felt something tightening around his chest. Invisible chains, not made of iron, but of words he never spoke. Each link forged from silence. And then the cathedral began to shake. Not collapse, he awakened. The pews groaned. The crucifix above the altar melted into black wax. The choir pit opened into a maw, lined with Bibles filled with inked out verses. Lucas raised a hand. "Do you want forgiveness?" he asked. Voice like thunder filtered through a dying prayer. Malric nodded, breathless. "Then you must find the page you tore out." "What page?" Lucas pointed to the mirror, and within it, a single Bible floated, open, but its pages were blank. All but one, smeared in red, a verse that had never existed, a verse Malric had written, but never dared read aloud. Episode 5, the verse that shouldn't exist. There are words too sacred to be spoken, and there are others so cursed. Heaven never heard them. Malric's knees cracked as he knelt before the mirror once more, though he wasn't sure if he was kneeling in penance, in fear, or because his body no longer obeyed him. Inside the mirror floated the Bible, ancient, battered, soaked in something blacker than ink. Its pages fluttered without wind, all blank, except one verse, not in Latin, not in Greek, but in a script that shifted every time he blinked, not written with a hand, but written by pain. Lucas stood beside him, his eyes no longer those of a child. They were endless, empty, like God had looked into him once and turned away. "Read it," he said. I don't recognize the language." Lucas didn't move, neither did the angels. That's why they couldn't erase it. The words, "Posidative, waiting." Malric reached toward the glass, and the verse slid into focus. Suddenly, he understood every syllable, not with his mind but with his soul. And the one who heard the cry but did not answer shall carry the echo through every vale, until the God he ignored becomes the mirror he cannot escape. The moment he read it, the cathedral screamed. Not the people, not Lucas. The walls, the roof, the air, they screamed in recognition. The floor beneath him cracked like dry bone. Blood seeped from the cracks. His cassock caught fire, yet it didn't burn. Lucas stepped back. Now, it knows who you are. What knows? The one behind the glass, the one who collects the souls that heaven rejects. Behind them, the mirror began to breathe, not metaphorically, literally. It inhaled, slowly, a low, guttural drawl, like clone starved for centuries, and from its surface, something began to rise. A hand, long, slender, fingers wrapped in thorn rosary, skin the color of faded parchment, on its palm a cross, carved upside down, and still bleeding. Malric scrambled back. "No, I confessed. I faced the verse." Lucas shook his head. "You read it, but you never lived it. You protected your title, not the child. And now the mirror has decided. You are not here for forgiveness. You are here to replace the reflection." The hand reached out, and Malric, for the first time in his priesthood, truly screamed. Episode 6, Replacing the Reflection. Most mirrors reflect light. This one reflected guilt, and now it was looking for someone to wear it. The hand reached farther through the glass, curling with slow, deliberate hunger. Malric tried to run, but the chapel's broken floor had become a pool of ash, thick and dragging like wet sand. Each step forward dragged him 3 steps closer to the mirror. Lucas stood unmoving behind him. "It doesn't want your body," he said. "It wants your silence, your refusal, your cowardice. That's what gives it shape." Malric's hands trembled, reaching for anything, a crucifix, a prayer, even breath, but nothing came. Behind the glass, a face began to emerge, not its full form, just a suggestion, eyes made of empty chalices, a mouth stitched shut with pages from a torn psalter, and where its heart should be, there was only a rosary, spinning in reverse. Malric sobbed. "What is it?" Lucas answered, his voice dull. "It's what's left when a priest dies without ever truly repenting." The hand touched Malric's chest. Cold, yes, but not in a physical sense. It was the cold of being unseen by heaven, a chill born not of temperature, but of divine abandonment. And then it pushed, not hard, just gently enough for Malric to stumble backward into the mirror. The surface swallowed him. He was standing again, same chapel, same altar, but the colors were gone. The candles were flouncing mid-flicker. The crucifix hung upside down, dripping wine like blood. He turned and saw himself, but not a reflection, an echo. And knew Father Malric stood in the real world, outside the glass, calm, pale, eyes hollow. The reflection raised a hand to the parish, began to preach, but the words were twisted versions of scripture, verses bent, truths reversed, each sentence a sermon of despair. "Blessed are those who never speak, for they shall not be judged." Malric screamed, banged on the inside of the mirror, but his fists made no sound. Lucas appeared beside him again inside the mirror now, still the boy, still bleeding. "You replaced your reflection. Now, you get to watch what your silence creates." The church outside filled with shadowed faces. No eyes, no mouths, only ears. They hung on every word the false priest spoke. And as Malric watched, powerless, Lucas leaned in close and whispered, "Do you know what the mirror does to those it consumes? It teaches them the value of speaking, by forcing them to listen for eternity." Episode 7, The Choir Without Tongues. He was trapped behind the glass, but the true prison was listening to what came after. From inside the mirror, time did not pass. There was no sun, no breath, no pulse, only sound. The false Malric, the one now preaching in his place, stood at the pulpit with hands folded in reverence and lips scrolled in heresy. Each word he spoke infected the ear like mold in an abandoned church. Forgiveness is for the loud, but the quiet earn eternity. In the congregation, not human anymore, figures Saturday in the pews, still enrobed, each face featureless, no mouths, no eyes, no nose, only smooth skin stretched over bone, with faint cracks where screams had once tried to escape. But they listened. They always listened. Malric watched from the mirror side, hands pressed against the inside, knuckles raw. He wanted to scream, to confess, to beg, but here, words were currency, and he had none left to spend. Behind him, the cathedral inside the mirror grew darker, not because of shadows, but because the stained glass windows were vanishing, one by one. Why are they fading? He asked, his voice barely a whisper, but Lucas heard. The boy Saturday on a bench of broken hymnals, staring at the void beyond the altar. Each window was a soul that believed, but when your reflection speaks lies in God's house, faith dies in the hearts of those listening. Lucas stood and turned toward Malric, eyes sunken, mouth stitched again, yet somehow still able to speak. You were never meant to be perfect. You were meant to be present. But when the cries of the hurting reached you, you chose ritual over rescue. Suddenly, the choir loft above began to hum, but they were no singers, only mirrors, down scenes of them, each one cracked, each one reflecting Malric in different stages of decay. And then they began to sing, a melody of moans, half prayers, and reverse psalms. The sound scratched at his mind, crawling beneath his skin. Kyrie eleison, Kyrie, deny me not, Kyrie. I was screaming, and you locked the door. Malric fell to his knees, clutching his ears. Make it stop, please. Lucas knelt beside him. It will stop when your voice finally carries the weight of truth. Malric looked up. The altar in the real world had caught fire, and yet the false priest continued, untouched, preaching to his blind congregation, a sermon of silence, a church of echoes, a God who had stopped listening, and the only way out was to speak a truth so deep it would shatter the mirror from the inside. Episode 8, The Truth That Cracks Glass. Confession doesn't begin when you speak. It begins when you admit the silence was your choice. Inside the mirror, Malric no longer moved. He knelt beneath the pulsing hum of the cursed choir, surrounded by reflections that weren't his but should have been, each one a version of himself crying, bleeding, burning locked behind the glass long before he arrived. They had all been men of the cloth, men who wore robes but had dropped, men who spoke of mercy and ignored the bleeding at their feet. The mirror had been waiting for him, not to punish, but to reveal. Lucas Saturday quietly at the edge of the altar, legs swinging as if he were still a child, but his gaze ancient. No one pierced deeper than Scripture ever had. You still haven't said it, he whispered. Malric lifted his head, said what? The truth, not about God, not about sin, about you. The candles inside the mirror flared, though no one stirred. The hymn from the choir warped voices breaking like bones. Malric rose to his feet, trembling. I didn't mean to abandon you, he said. I thought someone else would help. I thought if I stay quiet, it would go away. Lucas tilted his head. That's not the truth. That's the excuse you gave yourself to sleep at night. The mirror behind them rippled. Cracks formed, small, but spreading, like veins through a dying heart. Malric staggered toward the altar. I was afraid, he said louder now. His voice echoed through the empty cathedral, both inside and outside the mirror. I was afraid of losing my title, my name, my place in the church. Another crack shot across the mirror, splitting the stained glass of a saint's face in two. I saw what happened to you, Lucas. I heard you cry behind that door, and I walked away because I didn't want to carry your pain with me. Now the mirror screamed, not with sound but with pressure. It pulsed with rage, with light, with something sacred being wounded. Lucas stood, stepping close. One more step, one more truth. Malric shut his eyes. Tears cut lines down his face like cracks in stone. I didn't protect you, he whispered. I protected myself. As silence followed, heavy, holy, then the mirror shattered. Glass exploded outward in a storm of light and blood. Screams howled from every shard, flying in reverse. And through the storm, Marek was thrown out back into the real world. He landed hard on the chapel floor, alone, breathing, free. But the pulpit was empty, the false priest gone, and the pews were filled once more, not with eyeless ghosts, but with the faces of those he failed. Lucas Saturday in the front row, watching, waiting, and in Marek's trembling hands, a new Bible, its first page blank, waiting for the truth he would write with his life or die trying. Episode 9, The Gospel of the Damned. He shattered the mirror. But the story wasn't over, because once you confess, the next question is, will you live differently or just speak louder? Father Marek stood alone in the chapel, or so he thought. The broken shards of the mirror still littered the floor, each piece humming faintly like tiny mouths whispering verses only the damned could hear. The new Bible in his hands was heavier than any scripture he'd ever held, and yet every page remained blank, waiting, demanding. The first row of the chapel was still occupied. Lucas Saturday there, silent, real, but he no longer bled, he no longer wept. He stared, and Marek couldn't tell if it was forgiveness in his eyes or judgment. The priest opened the Bible, placed it on the altar, and whispered, "If I'm to write a gospel, it won't be about heaven. It'll be about what happens when we pretend we're already there." He picked up a pen, but when he tried to write, nothing came out. The ink wouldn't stain the page, because the page wasn't asking for words. It was asking for witness. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shook, not violently but rhythmically, as if footsteps echoed beneath the chapel floorboards. He turned. The pews began to fill, not with ghosts, but with people from his past, the abused, the silent, the forgotten. He recognized their faces, some older, some never aged at all, and in the far back corner, his own mother, eyes filled with the disappointment of a prayer she never spoke aloud. "You were chosen to carry souls," she said softly, "but you only ever carried your title." Marek fell to his knees. "I want to change," he muttered. "I do. I want to make it right." Lucas rose from the front pew and walked up to the altar. "Then speak to them, not about them, and not for your redemption, but for theirs." Marek stood, trembling. He turned to the crowd, and for the first time since his ordination, he spoke without script, without robe, without fear. "I see you, I felt you, and if I still breathe, then I will speak every day until the pain I caused becomes a home for your memory, not a prison." The candles reignited, but not with fire, with light. Each flame flickered to life as a name was remembered, one by one, and behind the altar, where the mirror had shattered, a new glass began to form, not reflective, but transparent. A window, not to heaven, not to hell, but to every soul who waited for someone brave enough to name what hurt them. The Gospel of the Damned had begun. Episode 10, A Pulpit That Faced God. He once preached about heaven from behind a mask. Now he preached to the forgotten with nothing but his scars. The chapel had changed, not rebuilt, not cleaned, but awakened. The once burned altar now pulsed with a soft light, as though forgiveness had decided to linger not as a blessing, but as a burden to carry. The broken pews welcomed the weight of memory, and the new glass window where the mirror once cursed framed something sacred. Truth. Father Marek stood before the crowd. Each face still carried the silence he once ignored, but now they listened not with hope, they listened with expectation, and he feared failing them again. He opened the Bible again, still blank, but the blankness no longer felt like absence. It felt like permission. "There was a boy," he began, voice dry but steady. "He asked me once, in a whisper behind the confessional, if I tell you something, will God still love me?" He paused. In the front pew, Lucas not just once. I told him yes, but then I told no one what he said. I buried his fear under incense and silence, and I told myself that I had protected the church, but I didn't. Marek's hands trembled as he laid the pen down. I protected its image, not its people. Suddenly, a new voice rang out. A woman in the third row, her face blurred, as if not fully formed by memory. "Why now?" she asked. "Why speak now, when we're already gone?" Marek stepped from the altar, tears rising. "Because I was wrong, and I don't want the next soul who whispers behind a door to be met with silence. If I can turn my voice into a bridge, maybe one of you can finally cross." The lights above flickered, not as a warning, As recognition, Lucas stood now. He approached slowly, barefoot on holy stone, the wound in his chest now sealed with gold thread erased. But honored, he placed a hand on Malric's shoulder. Then it's time. Time for what? Malric asked. Lucas looked toward the new window. Light streamed through, Ipor. Sacred, real, not sunlight, not divine fire, but the light of witness truth. You carried shame like it was scripture, but now you carry memory like it's gospel. Step through, and let the next sermon be your life. The window shimmered, and for the first time, Malric saw what lay beyond the glass. Not punishment, not paradise. A field, a chapel, a path, and on it, others, walking priests, mothers, children, forgotten souls, each one writing their own verse with each step forward. Malric looked back once, to that chapel, to Lucas, to the silence he had once chosen. Then he walked through the glass, not to escape, but to begin. Episode 11, where the saints never walked. He had walked through fire, through silence, through a mirror that reflected everything God turned his face from. But on the other side, there were no angels waiting, only echoes. Father Malric stepped into the light beyond the window. But what greeted him wasn't heaven. No golden gates, no trumpets, no peace, just a field, endless, dusty, filled with crumbled altars and forgotten prayers, etched into the wind like wounds that never fully closed. The sky was gray and stormy, not calm, as if it, too, was waiting for something to be said. Scattered across the land were chapels with no doors, each one half built, half buried, their pulpits empty, their mirrors untouched, and walking among them were others, men, women, children, each carrying a single object, a page, a verse, a name, a memory they had been denied the chance to speak aloud. They were not saints. They were the ones God's people forgot while pretending to save souls. Malric walked among them, clutching his blank Bible, but the farther he walked, the heavier it became, not from guilt but from memory finding weight again. A girl with burned hands handed him a candle that never melted. A boy missing a mouth pointed to a chapel and mouthed at him. Malric somehow remembered. An old man, skin translucent, whispered, "You heard me once. Now, speak me back into being." This was not a place for judgment. This was a place for voices to become flesh again. And at the center of the field stood a mirror. Tall, unbroken, but different. This one had no reflection, just light, endless and still. Lucas was waiting there, not as a boy, but as something older. His eyes no longer hollow, no, they burned with mercy that had survived fire. "This is the last one," he said. "The mirror that doesn't judge, doesn't lie, doesn't even reflect." Malric stepped toward it. "Then what does it do?" Lucas stepped aside. "It listens. And if you speak what was once buried, it becomes real again." Malric opened his Bible. The first page remained blank, but his hand no longer trembled. He didn't write. He spoke. Her name was Clara. She prayed every morning, even after the priest said she didn't belong. His name was Samuel. He confessed a sin he didn't commit, just to feel sane. And Lucas was a child who bled behind locked doors, while I told myself God would handle it. The wind stilled, the field brightened, not from the ski, from the chapels themselves. Each doorless church began to sing. Each abandoned prayer found its way back into the air, because someone had spoken them aloud. And as Malric looked back once more, he realized he had not walked into redemption. He had walked into a place where redemption was rewritten, one voice at a time. Episode 12, the prayer that reached backward. Not all prayers rise upward. Some dig down into graves, into guilt, into memory, and pull the dead back just long enough to be heard. The field had changed. The wind was no longer empty. It carried names, whispers, prayers once lost to silence now blooming again, like forgotten flowers pushing through secret ash. Malric stood in the center, before the mirror of light, the one that reflected nothing. Because truth needed no image, his hands were stained, not with blood, but with remembrance. And around him, the chapels had begun to breathe. Doors appeared where there had been none. Altars stood again, not pure, not polished, but honest. He turned to Lucas, no fully formed, his voice calm, his presence no longer that of a ghost, but a witness. "What happens now?" Malric asked. "What happens when they've all been spoken?" Lucas looked toward the horizon. More figures continued to gather, more writing every hour. They don't need your forgiveness. They need your voice to make their pain undeniable. That's what the church forgot. That's what the mirror was always waiting for. Malric stepped forward, opened the Bible again. Only now pages weren't blank. They were filled with entries in countless languages, names written in ink, in ash, in salt and oil and tears. Each page a confession that had never been allowed to exist until now. He ran his fingers along one name, Lucas Ephron, below it, the line. He spoke once. It was enough to change eternity. Malric's knees gave beneath him. Tears streamed down not of guilt, but of something pure, understanding. He had not been chosen to escape judgment. He had been chosen to carry it loudly so no one else would carry it alone. Behind him, a bell rang. It didn't sound like any bell from any cathedral. It rang like time collapsing inward, like 1,000 silenced voices suddenly deciding to rise. Lucas placed a hand on Malric's shoulder one final time. You were never damned. You were just unfinished. Then Lucas began to walk toward the mirror. But this time, it didn't pull him in. It opened like a gate. And being it, no heaven, no hell, just a pulpit of fire and memory, where every soul was given a voice. And Lucas became light. Malric stood alone, holding the Bible, holding every word they'd buried. He turned to the field, the people, the broken chapels now waiting, and he spoke, "Let us begin again, not with forgiveness, but with truth." And as he spoke, a single crack formed in the sky. But for once, it wasn't judgment descending, it was God finally listening.